The entire film crew stood frozen in complete silence as Whitney Houston, America's most successful recording artist, crouched in the corner of the soundstage with her hands covering her face, unable to stop crying. The cameras were loaded, the lighting was perfect, the scene was blocked, and one of Hollywood's biggest productions was now 3 hours behind schedule because their lead actress had just suffered a complete emotional breakdown in front of 70 cast and crew members. The director was furious, the producers were panicking, and studio executives were already making phone calls about replacement options. But Kevin Costner, who was not just the male lead, but also the film's producer and the man who had insisted on casting Whitney despite overwhelming opposition, did something that shocked everyone on that set. He walked over to Whitney, knelt down beside her, and whispered something that made her look up at him with an expression of pure disbelief. Then he stood, faced the crew, and announced that shooting was done for the day. Everyone was dismissed. The set was cleared. And what happened in the next 20 minutes in that empty soundstage with just Kevin and Whitney would not only save The Bodyguard from becoming one of Hollywood's most expensive disasters, but would also create a bond between two people that would last until Whitney's final breath 20 years later. Whitney Houston had never wanted to be a movie star. Her entire life had been built around music, around the voice that God had given her, around the recording studio and the concert stage where she felt powerful and confident and completely in control. But by 1992, at 28 years old, Whitney was being told by everyone around her that she needed to expand her brand, needed to prove she was more than just a singer, needed to conquer Hollywood the way she had conquered the music industry. Her management team saw dollar signs in film deals. Her record label saw opportunities for soundtrack albums. Her mother, the legendary gospel singer Whitney Houston, saw a chance for her daughter to achieve the kind of crossover success that few Black entertainers had ever managed. Everyone had an opinion about what Whitney should do with her career, but nobody seemed to care that Whitney herself was terrified of acting, had no training, had no experience, and had no idea how to translate the confidence she felt on stage into the vulnerability that great film performances require. When the script for The Bodyguard first came across her desk in early 1992, Whitney's initial reaction was to say no. The story of a famous singer being protected by a stoic bodyguard felt too close to her real life, too exposing, too risky for someone who had spent her entire career maintaining a carefully crafted public image. But Kevin Costner, who had been attached to The Bodyguard for nearly a decade and had turned down multiple actresses for the female lead, saw something in Whitney that she did not see in herself. He had watched her perform at the 1991 Super Bowl, that iconic rendition of the national anthem that had brought the entire country to tears during the Gulf War, and he had recognized in her performance not just vocal ability, but genuine screen presence, the kind of natural charisma that cannot be taught or manufactured. Kevin convinced Whitney to take the role by making her a promise that would prove to be both prescient and painful. He told her that he would protect her throughout the entire process, that he would make sure the film showcased her strengths rather than exposing her weaknesses, and that if she trusted him, he would help her create something that would live forever. Whitney, desperate for someone in her professional life who seemed to care about her well-being rather than just her commercial value, agreed to do the film. But from the moment she arrived on set for the first day of principal photography in July 1992, it became clear that making that promise and keeping that promise were two very different things. The movie studio that had reluctantly greenlit The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston in the lead role was already looking for ways to replace her before the first week of filming was complete, and the only thing standing between Whitney and professional humiliation was Kevin Costner's willingness to risk his own career to keep his promise. Warner Brothers executives had never wanted Whitney for the role. They had wanted a proven actress, someone with film experience, someone white, someone who fit their traditional model of what a Hollywood leading lady should look like. Kevin had fought them relentlessly, threatening to walk away from the project entirely if they did not cast Whitney, and the studio had eventually agreed only because Kevin was at the peak of his career following Dances with Wolves, and they could not afford to lose him. But their agreement came with conditions. If Whitney could not deliver a convincing performance, if she slowed down production, if she cost them money, they reserved the right to reshoot her scenes with a different actress. Kevin had agreed to these terms, believing that Whitney would prove them wrong within the first few days of shooting. But what actually happened was far more complicated and far more painful than anyone had anticipated. Whitney's first scene was relatively simple. She was supposed to walk through a crowd of screaming fans, look overwhelmed and frightened, and then be escorted to safety by Kevin's character. No dialogue, just reaction shots and physical movement, the kind of scene that an experienced actress could knock out in an hour or two. But Whitney, standing in front of the cameras with hundreds of extras screaming her name, completely froze. She could not move naturally, could not access the emotion the scene required, could not separate herself from the reality that these were not actors playing fans but actual fans who had been hired as extras and were genuinely screaming for Whitney Houston, the singer. After 17 takes with no usable footage, the director called for a break and pulled Kevin aside to express his concerns. This was not going to work. Whitney was too stiff, too self-conscious, too trapped in her own head. They needed to consider other options. Kevin's response was to ask for patience, to remind everyone that Whitney had never done this before, and to request that he be allowed to work with her one-on-one before they attempted the scene again. The director reluctantly agreed, and Kevin spent the lunch break in Whitney's trailer trying to help her understand that acting was not about being perfect. It was about being present, about responding truthfully to imaginary circumstances, about trusting that vulnerability on screen would read as strength rather than weakness. The afternoon takes were marginally better, and they managed to get enough footage to piece together a workable scene, but everyone on set could feel the tension building. Whitney was struggling, the crew was frustrated, and the studio executives who visited the set that first week went back to their offices convinced that Kevin Costner had made a catastrophic error in judgment by insisting on casting a singer with no acting experience in a $100 million production. Over the next 3 weeks, Whitney worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She studied acting technique with a private coach who came to her trailer every morning. She watched films starring actresses she admired, trying to understand how they made it look so effortless. She stayed late after shooting wrapped to rehearse scenes for the next day. But the harder she tried to be perfect, the more stiff and unnatural her performances became. She was so terrified of making a mistake, so conscious of the studio executives watching her every move, so aware that Kevin's reputation was on the line because of her, that she could not access any genuine emotion. Everything she did felt calculated and false, and she knew it, and knowing it made it worse. The breaking point came during the filming of the romantic confrontation scene, where Whitney's character accuses Kevin's character of trying to control her life, and the fear and self-doubt that Whitney had been suppressing for 3 weeks finally exploded in front of everyone. The scene required Whitney to be angry, to be raw, to be emotionally unguarded in a way that felt impossibly exposing for someone who had spent her entire career maintaining perfect control over her public image. They had been shooting for 2 hours, trying take after take to get the emotional intensity right, and Whitney could feel herself failing. She could see it in the director's face, could hear it in the increasingly terse instructions from the crew, could sense it in the way Kevin kept trying to adjust his own performance to somehow make hers work better. And then, in the middle of take 23, something inside Whitney just broke. She stopped midline, her voice cracking not with the emotion of the scene but with genuine panic and despair, and she just walked off set without a word to anyone. The director yelled cut, the crew exchanged concerned glances, and Kevin immediately followed Whitney as she retreated to the furthest corner of the soundstage, as far from the cameras and the watching eyes as she could possibly get. By the time Kevin reached her, Whitney had collapsed onto the floor with her back against the wall, crying so hard she could barely breathe. This was not the controlled, camera-ready crying of an actress delivering an emotional scene. This was the complete breakdown of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits and had finally hit the wall. Kevin knelt beside her, and the first thing he did was not try to give her a pep talk or tell her to pull herself together. He simply sat with her in that corner for 5 full minutes, saying nothing, just being present while she cried. The entire crew was still standing on set, confused and worried, wondering if they should intervene or give them space. The director started to walk over, but Kevin's assistant intercepted him and quietly explained that Kevin would handle this, that everyone needed to stay back and give them time. After those 5 minutes of silence, Kevin spoke, And what he said to Whitney was not what she expected to hear from her co-star and producer, whose film she was currently destroying with her inability to perform. He told her that she was trying to be the wrong person. She was trying to be a trained actress with years of experience and technique, trying to deliver the kind of polished performance that people would expect from a movie star, trying to be perfect because she had been taught her entire life that being perfect was the only way to be worthy of love and success. But that was not what Kevin had seen in her when he insisted she play this role. What he had seen was someone who was not afraid to be messy and real and human when she was singing, someone who could stand in front of thousands of people and be completely vulnerable because the music gave her permission to stop performing perfection and start performing truth. The problem was not that Whitney could not act. The problem was that she was trying to act instead of just being herself in imaginary circumstances. Kevin told her that every great film performance came from actors who were willing to be seen, to be imperfect, to stop protecting themselves and start revealing themselves. And then he said something that changed everything about how Whitney approached not just this film, but the rest of her life in the public eye. Kevin Costner looked Whitney Houston in the eyes while she sat on the floor of that soundstage with tears and makeup streaming down her face, and he told her that she was beautiful exactly as she was in that moment, broken and imperfect and human, and that if she could bring that reality to her performance instead of the polished perfection everyone expected from Whitney Houston, she would give one of the most powerful performances he had ever seen. Whitney stopped crying and just stared at Kevin for a long moment, trying to determine if he was just saying what he thought she needed to hear or if he actually meant it. Kevin, recognizing her skepticism, continued. He told her about his own early film experiences, about the times he had been fired from projects or told he was not good enough, about the constant pressure to maintain an image that felt increasingly disconnected from who he actually was. He told her that the only performances of his own that he was truly proud of were the ones where he had stopped trying to impress people and started trying to tell the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable or unflattering. And then he made her a promise, a secret agreement between the two of them that no one else on set knew about, a commitment that would bind them together for the next 20 years and would ultimately give Kevin the words he needed when he stood at Whitney's funeral and tried to explain to the world who she really was. Kevin told Whitney that he saw her, really saw her, not the image or the persona or the carefully controlled public face, but the real person underneath all of that who was scared and tired and desperate to be loved for who she was rather than what she could do. And he promised her that as long as he lived, he would protect that truth about her. He would make sure that when people remembered her, they remembered not just the voice and the fame, but the humanity and the vulnerability and the courage it took to keep performing when you felt like you were dying inside. He told her that her time in the spotlight would be extraordinary, but also painful. That fame at the level she was experiencing, it was fundamentally destructive to the soul, and that there would come a day when people would judge her and condemn her and reduce her to her worst moments. But when that day came, whether he was still there to defend her or whether she was already gone, he would tell the world the truth about who she really was, about the person he was sitting with in this moment, broken and beautiful and brave enough to keep trying even after she had failed publicly and painfully. Whitney asked Kevin why he was making this promise, why he cared so much about protecting her when they had only known each other for a few weeks. Kevin's answer was simple and devastating. He told her that he recognized something in her that he had seen in himself, a person who had been turned into a commodity, whose value had become tied to their ability to generate profit for other people, who had forgotten that they were human beings with limits and needs and vulnerabilities. And he had decided years ago that whenever he recognized that pain in someone else, he would do whatever he could to remind them of their humanity, even if it cost him professionally or personally. This was not about romantic attraction or professional obligation. This was about one human being seeing another human being's pain and refusing to look away. Whitney, who had spent most of her life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, who saw her as an asset to be managed or a talent to be exploited, was completely undone by Kevin's unexpected compassion. She had never experienced someone in her professional life offering her kindness without expecting anything in return, and it broke something open in her that had been locked away for years. The performance that Whitney gave in the takes immediately following her breakdown and Kevin's promise became the emotional heart of the entire film. And everyone on set knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. But none of them knew the secret conversation that had made it possible. When Whitney and Kevin finally returned to the set after their 20-minute private conversation, the entire crew was prepared for Whitney to ask for the day to be canceled, for shooting to be rescheduled, for someone to come in and fix whatever had broken down. Instead, Whitney walked directly to her mark, looked at the director, and asked if they could try the scene again immediately while the emotion was still fresh. The director, confused but hopeful, called for the cameras to roll, and what Whitney delivered in that next take was nothing like what she had been attempting in the previous 23 tries. She was not trying to be angry or controlled or actressly. She was just being herself, a scared person lashing out at someone who was trying to help her because accepting help meant admitting she needed it, and that admission felt like weakness. The vulnerability was real because she was not acting it. She was living it. And Kevin's response to her in the scene was equally real because he was not responding to dialogue. He was responding to the actual person in front of him who he had just promised to protect. The take lasted 6 minutes, twice as long as scripted, because neither of them wanted to break the moment, and the director was smart enough not to call cut. When it finally ended, there was absolute silence on set for several seconds before someone started applauding, and then the entire crew joined in, not in the polite golf clap way that crews sometimes acknowledge good work, but in genuine emotional response to witnessing something powerful and true. Whitney started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair, and Kevin hugged her while the crew stood around them in respectful silence. The studio executives who watched the dailies from that scene the next day were stunned. This was not the stiff, self-conscious performance they had been seeing for weeks. This was movie star charisma. This was emotional depth. This was exactly what they had been afraid Whitney could not deliver. The conversations about replacing her stopped immediately. The Bodyguard was back on track, and it was largely because Kevin Costner had been willing to stop being a producer, worried about schedules and budgets, and instead be a human being sitting with another human being's pain. The rest of the filming process was not without its challenges, but Whitney's confidence grew with each scene, especially after Kevin made sure that she was consulted about creative decisions rather than just being told what to do. It was actually Whitney who suggested that I Will Always Love You should be the film's main love theme, a suggestion that seemed odd at first because the Dolly Parton song was a country ballad that most people assumed could not be reinterpreted as a soul ballad. But Whitney heard something in that song that connected to the story they were telling, a story about loving someone enough to let them go, about protecting someone even when it means stepping back, about the difference between possessive love and liberating love. Kevin trusted Whitney's musical instincts completely and fought with the music producers to record the song the way Whitney wanted it done, stripped down and emotional rather than overproduced and slick. When Whitney recorded the final version in one take, singing the entire song straight through with no punch-ins or corrections, everyone in the studio knew they were listening to something that would become legendary. Kevin was in the recording booth that day, and he later said it was one of the most powerful musical experiences of his life, watching Whitney pour every ounce of emotion from the filming process into a song about love and loss and letting go. The Bodyguard premiered in November 1992 and became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. But more importantly for Whitney, it proved to the world and to herself that she was more than just a voice, that she was capable of being vulnerable on screen, that she could act. The film's soundtrack became the best-selling soundtrack album of all time, with I Will Always Love You spending 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Whitney's career reached heights that few entertainers ever experience. But the success came with costs that Kevin had warned her about. The pressure intensified, the demands on her time became overwhelming, the public scrutiny became suffocating. Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown, her struggles with addiction, her gradual withdrawal from public life, all of it happened under the microscope of fame that the Bodyguard had amplified. Kevin watched from a distance, concerned but respecting Whitney's privacy, occasionally reaching out to check on her but never attempting to intervene or judge. He had made her a promise that he would protect the truth about who she was. But he also understood that protecting someone sometimes means giving them space to make their own choices, even when those choices are destructive. Over the years, as Whitney's public image deteriorated and the tabloids turned her into a cautionary tale, Kevin rarely spoke publicly about their friendship or their experience making the Bodyguard. He believed that Whitney deserved to tell her own story in her own time, and he refused to participate in the media circus that constantly surrounded her. But he also never forgot the promise he had made on that soundstage in 1992, the promise that when the time came, he would tell the world who she really was. That time came on February 11, 2012, when Whitney was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and the world immediately began writing her obituary as a tragic figure who had wasted her talent and destroyed herself with drugs. Kevin, who was filming a project in New Mexico when he heard the news, immediately flew to Los Angeles knowing that he would be asked to speak at Whitney's funeral, and knowing that this was the moment he had promised her he would honor, the moment when he would tell the truth about the person he had known rather than the image the world had created. The eulogy that Kevin Costner delivered at Whitney Houston's funeral on February 18, 2012, was not the polished, sanitized celebrity tribute that most people expected, but instead it was the fulfillment of a 20-year-old promise to protect the truth about a woman the world thought it knew, but had never really understood. Kevin stood at the podium in the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, in front of Whitney's family, her friends, and a global television audience of millions, and he began by acknowledging the complexity of trying to summarize someone's life in a few minutes. But then he did something remarkable. He told the story of that day on the soundstage when Whitney had broken down, not to embarrass her or expose her vulnerability, but to illustrate the courage it took for her to keep going when everything in her wanted to give up. He told the congregation and the world that Whitney had been terrified during the Bodyguard, that she had questioned whether she deserved to be there, that she had struggled with the same insecurities and fears that everyone struggles with, but that she had done it anyway because she was brave enough to try even when she was scared. Kevin spoke about how Whitney had been raised in a church just like the one they were sitting in, how she had always felt the weight of representing not just herself, but her family, her community, her race, and how that pressure had been both empowering and crushing. He talked about how the world had wanted her to be perfect, to never make mistakes, to always be the wholesome girl next door with the angel voice, and how impossible that standard was for any human being to maintain. And then he said something that brought the entire church to tears. He said that Whitney had not been perfect, but that she had been real, and that her realness was what made her performances so powerful, what made her music so moving, what made her worthy of love even in her most difficult moments. Kevin told the world that Whitney Houston was not a cautionary tale or a tragic figure or a wasted talent. She was a human being who had lived an extraordinary life under impossible circumstances, who had brought joy to millions of people, and who had fought battles that no one watching her glamorous life from the outside could ever fully understand. The most powerful moment of Kevin's eulogy came when he addressed Whitney directly, speaking to her as if she could hear him, fulfilling the promise he had made 2 decades earlier. He told her that he had kept his word, that he had protected the truth about who she was, and that he hoped she finally felt free from the burden of everyone else's expectations. He told her that she had been beautiful exactly as she was, broken and imperfect and human, and that her willingness to be vulnerable in the Bodyguard had been one of the bravest things he had ever witnessed. And then he said the line that would be quoted in every news story about the funeral, the line that perfectly captured the essence of Whitney's struggle and Kevin's understanding of it. He said that the world had known Whitney Houston the superstar, but that he had known Whitney the person, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure people understood the difference, making sure they remembered that behind the voice and the fame was a woman who had loved deeply, struggled honestly, and deserved to be remembered with compassion rather than judgment. Kevin Costner's eulogy for Whitney Houston became one of the most viewed and shared pieces of content in the weeks following her death, not because it was sensational or revealing, but because it was honest and human and reminded people that celebrities are real people with real pain. The speech resonated particularly with people who had struggled with addiction, with perfectionism, with the pressure to maintain an image that did not match their reality. It gave permission for Whitney to be remembered as complex and flawed and still worthy of love, and it set a new standard for how we talk about celebrities who die tragically. Kevin's words helped shift the narrative about Whitney from cautionary tale to cautionary system, from individual failure to collective failure, from what was wrong with Whitney to what was wrong with a culture that creates unrealistic expectations and then punishes people for being unable to meet them. In the years since Whitney's death, Kevin has continued to honor her memory by speaking honestly about their friendship, about the promise he made, and about the importance of seeing people's humanity even when they are famous, even when they are struggling, even when they are failing. The legacy of Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston's friendship extends far beyond the Bodyguard and the eulogy. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do for someone is simply see them, really see them, not the image or the achievement, but the struggling human underneath who needs to know that they are worthy of love even when they are not perfect. Kevin's promise to Whitney was not to make her more successful or more famous or more beloved. It was simply to make sure that someone knew and remembered the truth about who she was, so that when the world inevitably tried to reduce her to a headline or a statistic, there would be at least one voice speaking the complicated truth. And in fulfilling that promise, Kevin Costner gave Whitney Houston something that fame and success never could: the knowledge that she had been truly seen, truly known, and truly loved for exactly who she was rather than what she could do for others. That knowledge, that gift, might not have saved her life, but it honored her death and continues to shape how we remember her today.